So last week we started with some foundational stuff about when Matthew was written, who wrote it, and why we can trust the Bible, all that good stuff. Now we're going to get to the actual text of Matthew, which is exciting. So why don't I pray to get us started, and then we'll take right off. God, we thank you for this day and this opportunity to gather together over your word and to study it for all it's worth. Lord, we pray that you would open our hearts and minds to hear from you and to learn your truth. God, be with us as we study. In Jesus' name, amen. So I've given you a printout of the verses we're going to be talking about today, so that you can, I know some people are not comfortable writing in their physical Bibles, so this is a great opportunity to circle and add notes or whatever if you want. So we're starting with chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. And I'll just read through the whole thing to start, get a big picture. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. It's riveting stuff, right? And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Matthan, and Matthan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. So first, why would Matthew start with the genealogy? There are a few reasons. One, because it connects to the Old Testament and the patriarchs. So he's basically saying he's taking up the story of the Old Testament by starting with the genealogy. And genealogies were significant and common among Jewish people. It's important for knowing what tribe you belong to and therefore what inheritance you're due, because different tribes had different lands, and specifically Levi you had to be of the tribe of Levi to be a priest, so on and so forth. Messiah was also prophesied to be a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and David. So this genealogy serves to confirm that Jesus is in fact a descendant of those people as he should be. So what's the big picture? What's the major thing we should take away from this genealogy? First, that Jesus is the Messiah or the Christ. This term is used especially of kings, the term Messiah, which means anointed one. They would call kings anointed, they would call priests anointed, and they would call prophets anointed. And Jesus functions as all three: king, priest, and prophet. This genealogy also teaches us that Jesus doesn't come from a line of perfect people, as we will see as we dive into this. It also teaches us that he is greater than Abraham. You see, genealogies are usually named after the earliest ancestor, not the latest descendant. So when you're reading Genesis, it would say this is the generation of Abraham and start with Abraham. It wouldn't say this is the generation of Noah if it ends with Noah. You see what I'm saying there? connected two people in the wrong order. Doesn't matter. So this, if he was using the conventional wisdom, he would have called this the book of the genealogy of Abraham, but instead he calls it the book of the genealogy of Jesus. So he's saying Jesus is the more important person here, more important than Abraham, which is a big statement among the Jewish people. So let's take a look at some of these people in the genealogy of Jesus. We start off with Abraham, who is the father of the nation of Israel. He was chosen to receive God's covenant. In other words, he was chosen to have a special relationship with God. And he's in the quote-unquote hall of faith in the book of Hebrews because he listened to God and left his family. And he even listened to God when he told him to sacrifice his son. Although when we read the story, God provided a substitute. Which is important foreshadowing, by the way, of God sacrificing his own son. We read in Genesis 22:18. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my command. So that's God's word to Abraham. God promises to bless all of the nations of the world through Abraham's offspring. And this passage is understood by the Jewish people to be messianic. It's talking about the Messiah or anointed one who will go on to bless all people. And Paul explains in Galatians chapter 3, verse 16. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as though referring to many, but referring to one, and to your seed, who is Christ. Or in other words, Paul is specifically explaining that when God promised to bless the nations through Abraham's seed, he meant Messiah, Jesus. So then we get to Isaac, who is the second-born, technically, of Abraham, and inherited the covenant of God after his father. He's the only son of Sarah. We read about their story in Genesis 17, 15 to 21. Should practice my sword drills. I've got a lot of flipping around to do. God said to Abraham, as for your wife Sarai, do not call her Sarai, for Sarah will be her name. I will bless her. Indeed, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will produce nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Abraham fell face down. Then he laughed and said to himself, can a child be born to a 100-year-old man? Can Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, give birth? So Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael were acceptable to you. But God said, no. Your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. I will confirm my covenant with him as a permanent covenant for his future offspring. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will certainly bless him. I will make him fruitful and will multiply him greatly. He will father 12 tribal leaders, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will confirm my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. Then we read later, in chapter 26 of Genesis, verses 1 to 5. So that's 26, 1 to 5. There was another famine in the land, in addition to the one that had occurred in Abraham's time. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, at Gerar. The Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land that I tell you about. Stay in this land as an alien, and I will be with you and bless you. For I will give all these lands to you and to your offspring, and I will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. I will give your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because Abraham listened to me and kept my mandate, my commands, my statutes, and my instructions. So there we have God confirming with Isaac that the promise continues through him. So then after Isaac, we have Jacob, who later gets renamed Israel. He's the second-born of Isaac, technically. He was a twin, but he was the second one to be born. He's known to be grasping. He has a reputation for grabbing for things. And he tricked his way into getting his older brother's inheritance. Sounds like a great guy, right? He in turn was tricked by Laban into marrying his less desirable daughter Leah before eventually marrying her sister Rachel. He had 12 sons total, from whom the 12 tribes of Israel get their name. He also received the name Israel from God in a wrestling match, and the name means wrestles with God. Israel wrestles with God, and became the name of the entire nation. An appropriate name when you read the history of Israel in the Bible. In Genesis 32, 22 to 32, we read, "During the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 slave women, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, along with all his possessions. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, 'Let me go, for it is daybreak.' But Jacob said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' 'What is your name?' the man said. 'Jacob,' he replied. 'Your name will no longer be Jacob,' he said. 'It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed.' Then Jacob asked him, 'Please tell me your name.' But he answered, 'Why do you ask my name?' And he blessed him there. Jacob then named the place Peniel. 'For I have seen God face to face,' he said, 'yet my life has been spared.' The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel, limping because of his hip." So he wrestled with God and got renamed Israel. And then later we read in chapter 35, verses 9 to 15, God appeared to Jacob again after he returned from Paddan Aram, and he blessed him. God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. You will no longer be named Jacob, but your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. God also said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation, indeed an assembly of nations, will come from you, and kings will descend from you. I will give to you the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, and I will give the land to your future descendants." Then God withdrew from him at the place where he had spoken to him. Jacob set up a marker at the place where he had spoken to him, a stone marker. He poured a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. Jacob named the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. So that's Israel. Not everyone on this list is going to have so much detail, by the way. Next we have Judah, who was the 4th son of Jacob, and he was the sort of leader or spokesperson for his brothers. He protects Joseph from being murdered and pledges himself as a substitute for Benjamin later in the story. So you'll remember Joseph. Joseph really messed up with his brothers and told them about a dream he had where he became a ruler over them. So they conspired to throw him into this well, I believe it was, and they were going to kill him, but Judah was like, "No, let's just sell him into slavery." So he sort of saved his life by suggesting that. And then later on, when they don't know who Joseph is yet in in Egypt, Joseph asks them to bring their younger brother Benjamin, and Judah offers to be a substitute for Benjamin to ensure his safety. So if he swears to his father that if Benjamin doesn't come back, I will pay the penalty, and so on and so forth. Jacob gives Judah a blessing that includes his brothers bowing to him and implies that he will have royal descendants, which we read in Genesis 49, verses 8 to 10. Judah, this is Jacob's blessing on Judah. "Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the necks of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you return from the kill. He crouches. He lies down like a lion or a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belongs to him." So that's a really interesting blessing because it implies that the kingship will never leave Judah's descendants. And it also mentions someone whose right it is to come, right? So this is one of those passages that is considered to be messianic. So it's also talking about the Messiah or anointed one about to come. Then we have Tamar. Here's where we really start to get into the shadier part of Jesus' family tree. So Tamar is the widow of Judah's firstborn heir. So Judah's firstborn heir who died before he could have any children. So Omar, who was Judah's secondborn, was supposed to, by custom, have children with Tamar so that his brother's bloodline would continue. But he refuses to do so, so he gets struck down and killed by God for disobeying. But then Judah tells Tamar to wait because he has a third son named Shelah, who's not yet old enough to marry. But then Judah fails to actually arrange the wedding. The time comes and passes and he doesn't give his third son in marriage to Tamar, maybe because the other two sons who he married off to her died. So he might have been a little skeptical about that. So when he fails to arrange the promised marriage, Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute and seduces Judah on the road. So she asks him for payment to give her his signet ring as like a sign, and so she takes that, and he accuses her of moral failure because she becomes pregnant, right? And so he plans to have her killed, but then she shows him the ring, and he realizes that she was disguised as a prostitute, and he's the father. And then she gives birth to twins, Perez and Zerah. So I don't know about you guys, but I don't have anything quite like that in my family tree. So Genesis 38, 1 to 26 tells the whole story. We'll skip down here a little bit. Yeah, we read in verse 18, "What should I give you?" he asked. She answered, "Your signet ring, your cord, and the staff in your hand." So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. She got up and left, then removed her veil and put her widow's clothes back on. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend Adulamite in order to get back the items he had left with the woman, he could not find her. He asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was beside the road at Enaian?" "There has been no cult prostitute there," he answered. So the Adulamite returned to Judah, saying, "I couldn't find her, and besides, the men of the place said that there has been no cult prostitute here." Judah replied, "Let her keep the items for herself, otherwise we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send this young goat, but you couldn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has been acting like a prostitute, and now she is pregnant." "Bring her out," Judah said, "and let her be burned to death." Yikes. As she was being brought out, she sent her father-in-law this message, "I am pregnant by the man to whom these items belong." And she added, "Examine them. Whose signet ring, cord, and staff are these?" Judah recognized them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her intimately again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife took it and tied a scarlet thread around it, announcing, 'This one came out first.' But then he pulled his hand back, and out came his brother, and she said, 'What a breakout you have made for yourself.' So he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread tied to his hand, came out and was named Zerah." So it's interesting that in the genealogy of Jesus, not only are Judah and Perez mentioned, but also Tamar, to sort of remind you of that thing that happened. So Perez is really only notable for the story of his birth, which we just read, where his arm breaks out first, and then they tie the scarlet cord around it, but then his brother actually ends up being born first. And then, after Perez, we have Hezron, Ram, and Amminadab. The Bible doesn't really have anything to say about those guys. And after that, we have Nashon, who was the leader of the tribe of Judah while Israel was wandering in the wilderness. The only thing we have about him is in Numbers chapter 2, verse 3. It It says, Judah's military divisions will camp on the east side toward the sunrise under their banner. The leader of the descendants of Judah is Nation, son of Amminadab. That's it. That's his whole impact on the scripture. Then we have Salmon, who's not really known for anything except marrying Rahab. Rahab we know a little bit more about. She was a prostitute from the city of Jericho, who was spared in the city's destruction because she protected the spies from Israel, who came to investigate the city. And she's actually remembered in Hebrews as an example of faith, and also she's mentioned in the book of James. So we have Joshua chapter 2, 1 to 14 that tells her story. Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 men as spies from the acacia grove, saying, Go and scout the land, especially Jericho. So they left, and they came to the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, Look, some of the Israelite men have come here tonight to investigate the land. Then the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab and said, Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, for they came to investigate the entire land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. So she said, Yes, the men did come to me, but I didn't know where they were from. At nightfall, when the city gate was about to close, the men went out, and I don't know where they were going. Chase after them quickly, and you can catch up with them. But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them among the stalks of flax that she arranged on the roof. The men pursued them along the road to the fords of the Jordan, and as soon as they left to pursue them, the city gate was shut. Before the men fell asleep, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and everyone who lives in the land is panicking because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, with the 2 Amorite kings you completely destroyed across the Jordan. When we heard this, we lost heart, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now please swear to me by the Lord that you will also show kindness to my father's family, because I showed kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all who belong to them, and save us from death. The men answered her, We will give our lives for yours. If you don't report our mission, we will show kindness and faithfulness to you when the Lord gives us the land. So then she gets mentioned again in Hebrews 11:31. In the famous Hall of Faith. By faith, Rahab the prostitute welcomed the spies in peace and didn't perish with those who disobeyed. So she makes it into the Hall of Faith for what she did there. And then in James, I flipped past it. James chapter 2, verse 25. In the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute also justified by works in receiving the messengers and sending them out by a different route? So then we have, next in the line, we have Boaz and Ruth, whose story we read in the book of Ruth, right? Boaz was a kindly man who's famous for his role in the book of Ruth as Ruth's kinsman redeemer. A relative who married her so that her late husband's inheritance could be retained by the family. And Ruth was a Moabite woman who had married one of the sons of Naomi. She traveled to Israel as an act of loyal love towards Naomi when they were both widowed. And she met and married Boaz there. Then we have Obed, who's the grandfather of David, which is, not a small thing, but otherwise unknown. Then we have Jesse, who's the father of King David, and also otherwise relatively unknown. But Messianic prophecy identifies the Messiah as root of Jesse's stump in Isaiah 11:1. So, Isaiah 11, verse 1 says, Then a shoot will grow from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. So this was an important prophecy because, at this time in exile, there were no kings in the line of David that were really ruling over the kingdom, right? So the image imagery of a shoot coming up from the stump of David. It's a restoration of kingship. Then we have David. King David, the infamous second king of Israel, who was chosen to replace Saul, and chosen despite being his father's youngest son. He reigned from 1010 to 970 BC, and he's described as a man after God's own heart, which is a pretty big compliment. He stands out as a righteous king. However, he famously had a pretty big moral failure in the story of Bathsheba, and later with his rebellious sons. He also wrote a significant amount of the Psalms of Israel. We read in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 to 16, the promise that God gave to him. So 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 to 16. When your time comes and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up after you your descendant, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name and will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will discipline him with a rod of men and blows from mortals. But my faithful love will never leave him as it did when I removed it from Saul, whom I removed before you. It's the important part. Your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. So that's a promise that gets fulfilled in Messiah, because otherwise the promise isn't fulfilled, because there's no king after David's line in Israel right now. And of course, there are tons and tons of messianic prophecy about him being a son of David, so much so that Israelites would just casually refer to the Messiah as Son of David. That was one of his more important titles. We also have mentioned specifically in the genealogy Bathsheba, except she's not even in the genealogy with her name. It says fathered by the wife of Uriah, as if to rub it in exactly what happened there. Because she was a married woman who King David slept with while her husband was off to war. She becomes unexpectedly pregnant, which leads to David's conspiracy to kill her husband to cover up their adultery. And their first child is killed as an act of judgment from God for their sin. So, talk about your messy family tree. Next up we have Solomon, who was the son of David, and he was known as a wise king of Israel. He was renowned for his wisdom not only in Israel, but also amongst all the nations. When God asked him what he desired for, he asked for wisdom, and because he asked so well, he was also given wealth and power. He is the one who built the temple of God and who wrote most of the book of Proverbs, as well as the other wisdom books of the Hebrew scriptures. Sadly, though, he was eventually led astray by his many wives, many of whom were political marriages, right? And therefore from other nations who didn't worship the God of Israel. So they led him to idolatry. Then after Solomon we have Rehoboam. He is famous for listening to some foolish young advisors who convinced him to deal harshly with the Israelites, which caused them to revolt and split the kingdom of Israel in two. So he was the first king of Judah when it split into Judah and Israel. Then we have Abijah, who only reigned as king for 3 years and was summarized in the book of 1 Kings as an evil king. Then we have Asaph, who was the third king of divided Judah. He was a religious reformer who destroyed a bunch of idols and abolished male prostitutes in the temple. Jehoshaphat was next in line. He was another religious reformer who sent out teachers and Levites to teach the people to obey God. He led a very prosperous Judah. Then we have Joram, or Jehoram, as he's also known, who was another evil king of Judah, who allied closely with Israel and is blamed for leading Judah to worship idols, just like their neighbors Israel. Then, interestingly enough, Matthew skips several people who aren't in his genealogy. Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah. He just skips over them. And he goes straight to Uzziah, who's also known as Azariah. I guess there was a common practice in ancient times of having multiple names. I guess it's not that strange. Joshua, Josh, sort of the same thing. Anyway, so Uzziah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but he didn't remove all of the idolatrous places of worship. He was precluded from reigning early due to a skin disease, so he didn't step down as king. Well, he didn't end his reign by dying. He ended his reign by having a skin disease and stepping down and sharing the authority with his son Jotham, who's next up. He was recognized as a righteous king in both the Book of Kings and Chronicles. Then we have the infamous Ahaz, who was a very evil king, whose failure eventually led to God's declaring divine judgment on Judah. So Judah had been failing for a long time, but it was at Ahaz that God finally said, it's over. Here's the prophecy that Judah is going to be destroyed as a nation, and you're going to be sent into exile. Then we have Hezekiah, who, when he is attacked by the nation of Assyria, he seeks out God and comes back to God and is remembered as a righteous king. He was very ill, and the prophets predicted that he would die, but he prayed, and God actually extended his life for 15 years in response to his prayer. Then we have Manasseh, who was famous for bringing back idol worship. This is the cycle in Judah's history, right? They do well, then they worship idols. They do well, they worship idols. He is reported to be directly responsible for the fall of Judah, and he is remembered as a very evil king. Then we have Amos, who followed his father's example and also worshipped idols, and was assassinated by his own officials. Then we have the last good king, Josiah, who was well regarded and called a righteous king, who brought the people of Israel back to Yahweh and restored the place of the book of the law. There's a famous story of him finding the book of the law in the temple and realizing how astray they were and leading the people to this big move of repentance and tears. Then Matthew again skips somebody. He skips Jehoiakim and goes straight to Jeconiah, who's also known as Jehoiachin. He was the final king of Judah before the fall of Judah and the deportation to Babylon. He was evil like Jehoiakim, and he was told that he'd never have a son on the throne of David. So that was the end of Judah. Israel had already been ended before. You remember Judah, Israel separated into two nations. But that was the final straw for the nation of Judah. Then we have Shealtiel. We don't really know anything about him. We have Zerubbabel, who was the governor of Judah during the Babylonian exile, and he rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. Or helped to rebuild it, I should say. And then we have a list of names that we know nothing about. Abiud, Eliakim, Azor, Zadok, Achim, Eliab, Eleazar, Mathan, and Jacob. Don't know anything about any of those guys, except that they appear in this genealogy. Then we have Joseph. You can sense we're getting to the end here, right? Joseph is the adopted father of Jesus. He would be his father in a technical, legal sense in Israel. He's the husband of Mary, and he obeys God when God speaks to him in a dream, which is an interesting callback to the other Joseph, right? So you have Joseph in the Old Testament, who God speaks to in dreams, and then you have Joseph, the adopted father of Jesus, who also hears from God in dreams. It's very likely that Joseph died before Jesus was crucified, because when Jesus is being crucified, he appoints people to take care of Mary, and he wouldn't have had to do that if Joseph was alive. Also, he's just curiously absent from the rest of the story after the birth narrative. There's no mention of him whatsoever. So he probably died pretty early on. And that is all the people in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. So you'll notice that at the end of the genealogy, Matthew says, so all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Christ, 14 generations. So the question naturally is what's with the number 14, right? Because it doesn't naturally fall that way, because he has to skip over some people to make it the number 14. So why would he do that? Well, in ancient times, before we all agreed on Arabic numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on, a lot of different peoples would just use their letters as numbers. So the Jewish people used letters as numbers. So every letter in the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical value. And there's superstitious ways people look at Hebrew words and use numbers to predict things, and most of the time it's nonsense. But anyway, the name David in Hebrew equals 14. So if you put the numbers together and the consonants in David, it equals the number 14 in the Hebrew alphabet. So that's why Matthew points out the 14 thing and why he makes the genealogy fit into 14 generations. Also, probably in part just to help people memorize it. Because this was a culture, right, where you wouldn't just go buy a book. Most people couldn't own paper. It was a very expensive resource. So you would just memorize things. So if Matthew was writing this book, assuming most people wouldn't have a copy of it, they'd just memorize it, he might have done that just to make it easier on the people who were reading it. It's also interesting that Matthew includes women in his genealogy, which was not common practice. Most of the time you would just list all of the names of the men in the genealogy. And it's interesting that the women in question are all foreign to Israel. None of them were Israelites by birth. Perhaps to emphasize the fact that the gospel was not just for Israel. It was for all the nations. So he's including Gentiles in the genealogy of Jesus, which is really important. But also the women are of questionable moral character. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Rahab was a prostitute. Tamar seduced her father-in-law while posing as a prostitute. And Bathsheba was an adulterous woman. Perhaps Matthew included these stories to show the redeeming work of God in using broken people to bring about his salvation. Jesus isn't perfect because he comes from a perfect human family. He's perfect because he's God and man, right? So his family tree is just as ugly as everyone else's, right? So we get to the controversy found in this genealogy. You might not have expected there to be controversy, but if you read Matthew chapter 1 verses 1 to 17 and compare it to Luke chapter 3 verses 23 to 38, they both give genealogies, but they don't quite match up. The first difference is, of course, Luke starts way further back. He actually starts out by saying Adam was the son of God, so he starts with God and works all the way down to Joseph. So you can only really start comparing them when you get to Abraham. So I've actually given you the chart that I have made here. So then from Abraham until Ram-ish, they all line up. Actually, and they continue basically until, Solomon and Nathan. That's where they start to differ. And then after that, they're mostly different, but they have a couple names that are the same. Like they line up in a couple places that is interesting. Matthew follows Solomon, Luke follows Nathan. So there are two different genealogies basically from that point on. A couple names agree, but it could be coincidences because there was a lot of reused names in the Jewish society. So there's a few possible solutions to this. Actually, I have four. Four possible solutions to harmonize these two genealogies. The first solution is that Matthew and Luke use different names for the same people. Like I've talked about before, it was pretty common to have more than one name at that time, especially since they didn't have last names. So sometimes you'd use multiple names so that you could identify who was, if there were 13 Jehoshaphat's in your city, like you might go by a different name, but you're still technically named Jehoshaphat. And honestly, that's the least satisfying solution to me, because there has to be a lot of people in the genealogy who happen to go by different names. So not super satisfying. Number two It's possible that Joseph is the son of a Levirate marriage. So this is an interesting theory. To read in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 to 6, we read about what a Levirate marriage is. I might not be pronouncing that word correctly, because I've mostly only ever read it. When brothers live on the same property and one of them dies without a son, the wife of the dead man may not marry a stranger outside the family. Her brother-in-law is to take her as his wife, have sexual relations with her, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law for her. The first son she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, so his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So basically the idea is Joseph might have two fathers. Matthew might be taking his actual birth father and following him back, and Luke might be following his actual, legal father, in the sense of the brother who died. But that's not in the text at all, it's not mentioned explicitly, so it might be a bit of a reach for an explanation, right? Probably the most popular explanation is number 3. Matthew gives the genealogy of Joseph, while Luke gives the genealogy of Mary. So that it's a satisfying answer in the fact that it would make Jesus both legally and biologically in the line of David. Legally by his father, because you would consider someone's descendants by their father, not by their mother. But also because Joseph isn't actually his dad. If Mary is also from the line of David, then he's doubly so the son of David. This, however, is also not explicitly stated. Luke never says that he's tracing Mary's ancestry. He still refers to Jesus' grandfather as being the father of Joseph. So if we turn there, it's Luke chapter 3. There we go. So we read in Luke 3:23, as he began his ministry, Jesus was about 30 years old and was thought to be the son of Joseph, the son of Heli, son of Matthat, son of Levi, so on and so forth. But, when you call someone a father of someone, you could mean father-in-law. They didn't really have a term father-in-law, right? So they would just call your wife's father your father. So that could be what Luke meant. So that's the most popular one. Fourth explanation, a little harder to explain. Matthew traces the legal inheritance of the throne, while Luke traces the physical descent from father to son. So this explanation basically is saying that Matthew isn't necessarily tracing who all of the fathers are. He's tracing who is the legal inheritor to the throne. So he's saying that after David was Solomon, who was legally the next in line, and then so on and so forth, going down to Jesus. So their lines are different because some of the ancestors of Jesus weren't technically first in line for the throne. See what I'm saying there? So, again, the text of Scripture doesn't mention this. So all of these are just theories. But it's important to note that in order to defend the Bible as inerrant, which is what we as Christians and Restoration Movement believe, you don't have to prove that any one of these solutions is the solution. You basically just have to show that there's possible explanations for the contradiction to make it no longer a contradiction. You see what I'm getting at there? So what? So why does this matter? Why did we spend so much time going over the genealogy of Jesus? Well, reflect on your own family history. I remember when I was training for Youth for Christ, we did this exercise where we drew our family tree, but we didn't just draw all of the physical relations of our family tree. We also drew lines to represent broken marriages, addictions, and other moral failures in our family. And no in that room had a family tree that wasn't full of mess, right? We all have broken relationships and broken families somewhere. And Jesus can relate. Jesus' family is not without blemish. And it also shows that God uses broken things. I mean, of course he does. He uses any human being. He's using a broken thing, right? Except for Jesus, of course. And we can also, praise God, even in this genealogy, that already we're seeing the gospel reaches out to other nations. Not only because Abraham was promised to bless many nations, but because there are several women in the genealogy who are not of Israel. And we can also reflect on the importance of Jesus as being the anointed one of God. He is the Messiah prophesied from the beginning, right? He fulfills the necessary obligation to be of the line of David, from the family of Judah, Abraham, so on and so forth. And we can also rest assured that when we look at Matthew and Luke's genealogies, there are good explanations for why they don't match up, and they aren't a contradiction in Scripture. So there you go. Whew, we made it through the genealogy. Hi there. Thanks for watching our videos. I hope that they blessed you greatly. And if you were blessed, feel free to subscribe, share our videos, all that good stuff. And if you live in Fredericton or near Fredericton, feel free to join us Sunday mornings at 10:30 for our live in-person service. We'd welcome you as a part of our family. God bless.